The Battle of Orgreave, a day that shaped British history. Hello, friends and anyone fascinated by stories of struggle and human fate. Today, I want to talk about an event you're unlikely to find in school textbooks but one that left a deep mark on British history, the Battle of Orgreave. It happened on June 18, 1984, in the small town of Orgreave, South Yorkshire, England, and became a climax of the confrontation between miners and authorities during the 1984–1985 strikes. You described it as a vivid episode in the trade unions' fight for subsidies, wages, and the preservation of mines, and I agree, it was a real war, just without conventional weapons. Tens of thousands of people, police with batons, horses, barricades. It sounds like a movie scene, but it was stark reality that still gives me chills. I didn't live through those times myself, but digging into history, I feel how this day reflects not just the miners' struggle but the spirit of an era, a time when Margaret Thatcher was reshaping the country, and workers were trying to defend their future. Why did Orgreave become a symbol? What really happened there? And why was it barely mentioned back then but remembered now? Let's break it down step by step, mixing in my reflections and the perspective on how this battle influenced Britain and its people. Part 1. The backstory. Why did the miners take to the streets? The 1984–1985 strikes, a fight for survival. The Battle of Orgreave didn't come out of nowhere. It was the peak of a year-long miners' strike, one of the largest in British labour history. It all started in March 1984 when the National Coal Board announced the closure of 20 mines and the layoffs of 20,000 workers. The miners, united under the National Union of Mine Workers led by Arthur Scargill, said, no. They weren't just demanding to keep their jobs, they wanted increased subsidies for the coal industry, better wages, and social guarantees. You mentioned these goals, and I see in them a desperate bid to hold on to what was the backbone of entire regions, especially South Yorkshire, where coal wasn't just work but a way of life. Thatcher, the Conservative Prime Minister, viewed the coal industry as unprofitable and outdated. Her plan was clear: cut back the trade unions, close unviable mines, and shift the economy to gas and oil. To her, the miners were an internal enemy, her own words, no exaggeration. The government prepared for the fight in advance, stockpiling coal, bolstering the police, and passing anti-union laws. The strike wasn't just an economic protest, it became a clash of ideologies: workers versus capital, unions versus the state. Orgreave, why there? You noted, the coke plant in Orgreave became a focal point of the confrontation. It's no coincidence. The plant in South Yorkshire processed coal into coke for the steel industry, a strategic target. The miners aimed to block its operations, disrupting supplies and hitting the economy where it hurt. By June 1984, the coke works had become a symbol of their resistance. On the 18th, thousands of strikers from across the country gathered there, some say 5,000, others 10,000. Opposing them was a police force. You mentioned around 10,000 officers, though estimates range from 6,000 to 8,000. This was a full-scale preparation for battle, and both sides knew a clash was coming. My thoughts: I'm struck by the scale. Tens of thousands of people risking everything for their beliefs. This wasn't just a strike, it was a people's uprising. But even then, it was clear, the odds were uneven. Thatcher had been gearing up for years, while the miners, united as they were, lacked the same resources. Orgreave became a battlefield not by chance, it was a test. Would the workers break or not? Part 2. The day of the battle. What happened on June 18, 1984? Morning. Tension builds. You described the start, a prolonged standoff under the blazing sun. That's spot on. June 18th was hot, and thousands of miners had gathered at the plant since early morning. Some played football, others traded jabs with the police, ordinary folks, not soldiers, trying to keep their spirits up. The police formed cordons with tall shields, blocking the way to the factory. You said, everyone was waiting for the coal trucks, and that was the crux. If those trucks got through, the blockade would fail, and the miners would lose their leverage. I can picture it: dust, sweat, shouts, the air thick with tension. The miners weren't professional rebels, they were workers, family men, fighting to live, not just survive. The police, ordinary people too, but under orders, armed with shields and batons, ready to enforce the will of the state. The morning dragged on, and everyone knew something was about to happen. Midday, escalation and assault. By midday, as you wrote, new forces arrived, units with short shields and batons. These were freshly formed mobile police squads, not for defense but for attack. Then came the mounted units. Horses in a crowd are always intimidating. The miners tried to storm the cordons, some threw stones, others pushed forward. You noted, the police were pelted with rocks, they responded with batons. It was chaos, yells, the clatter of hooves, the clang of shields. The police advanced, driving the strikers toward a bridge over the River Don, a narrow choke point with no retreat. The miners built barricades from whatever they could find, boards, tires, debris. You mentioned, they couldn't stop the plant's operations. That's the bitter truth. The police held their ground, the trucks got through, and the blockade collapsed. Dozens were hurt. You cited over 50 injured miners and more than 70 wounded officers, numbers close to the real tally, around 120 casualties on both sides. My impressions: I'm in awe of the miners' resilience, standing in the heat, charging shields, building barricades against horses and batons. But I also get the police's side. They were under orders, and Thatcher didn't tolerate weakness. This wasn't a tale of heroes and villains, it was a collision of two worlds, each believing in its own truth. It's a pity the miners lost that round, they were vastly outnumbered by the system. Part 3. Why was Orgreave hushed up? Silence in the press. You pointed out, in June 1984, the clashes barely made the news. That's shocking. The fiercest confrontation of the strike, and the papers were quiet. Why? The media were either under government sway or afraid of Thatcher's wrath. Reports framed the miners as troublemakers and the police as guardians of order. Photos of batons and blood surfaced later, when journalists began dissecting her legacy. I've seen old footage, miners in t-shirts facing helmets and shields, an unequal fight. But the news back then spun a different story. Scargill leads a riot against the law. The public was sold the idea that the strike was chaos, not a fight for rights. Resonance years later. You said, photos gained traction years later. That's true. In the 90s and 2000s, after Thatcher's exit and the union's decline, people started rethinking Orgreave. Historians and reporters dug into archives. The police overstepped, beating people on the ground, arresting without cause. In 2016, declassified files confirmed the authorities' brutality. Orgreave became a symbol of the miners' defeat but also their courage. My reflections: the press blackout is a lesson. Whoever controls the narrative writes history. I think if social media existed in 1984, Orgreave would have exploded globally, videos of horses and batons would have gone viral instantly. But back then, the truth came too late, when the miners had already lost. Part 4. The aftermath. What happened to the miners and Britain? The miners' defeat. The strike ended in March 1985. The miners returned to work empty-handed. You didn't mention the outcome, but I'll add, out of 187 mines, 97 were closed, tens of thousands lost Robotu. The unions were crippled, and Thatcher solidified her power. Orgreave proved the state would go all out to crush resistance. Orgreave's legacy. South Yorkshire still bears these scars. Towns like Orgreave emptied out, coal faded into history. But the memory lingers. The miners became a symbol of defiance against the system. I've heard how Brits still debate, was Thatcher right to kill off coal, or was it a betrayal of the working class? My perspective: for me, Orgreave is a tragedy and a lesson. The miners lost, but their grit inspires. I see it as a turning point. Britain chose markets over people. Looking at abandoned mining towns today, I wonder, was it worth it? Conclusion. The Battle of Orgreave, a past echoing in the present. The Battle of Orgreave on June 18, 1984, wasn't just a clash of miners and police, it was a cry for justice. You called it one of the key episodes of the strikes, and I see more. It's the voice of people who weren't heard. The miners fought for their lives and got batons and defeat. I admire their bravery and regret the odds were stacked against them. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's debate this day that changed Britain.